If the post-Easter stories in the Bible make anything clear, it's got to be this. Nobody saw the resurrection coming. Nobody was expecting this to really happen. If the cross was a surprise, if the disciples and the crowds that had invested so many hopes in him were shocked to see him humiliated and killed, well, the resurrection went way beyond that. It seems that nothing had prepared them for the idea that Jesus would actually rise again. That might seem strange at first, because we can go back and look through the Gospels for the spots where Jesus hinted at or even said pretty explicit things about this, like the Son of Man must be killed and on the third day rise again. That sounds pretty clear, right? We can sit here in our comfortable chairs with our Bibles open 2,000 years later and say, come on, James and John and Thaddeus, weren't you all listening? Were you daydreaming when he was talking about a seed going down in the ground and dying and only then rising in shoots of new life? What about that analogy did you not understand? We can point to Jesus' words and his teaching, to all these opportunities that the disciples had to make sense of the resurrection while Jesus was still there with them. But if we're honest about it, I think, we can understand their predicament. Because it's one thing to talk about death and resurrection, and it's really another thing to sit with the silence of the day after Good Friday, the silence of a great big empty space where someone you loved once was. It's one thing to talk about seeds and new life, and it's another thing to believe in the resurrection with that immense silence of the tomb ringing in your ears. So as much as Jesus might have talked about this, as much as he might have tried to prepare his disciples for it, the Gospels all make it pretty clear that Jesus' followers were not all just calmly and hopefully watching for the resurrection on the third day and in the days that followed. They were operating as though this particular death was going to go the way of all other deaths, as though that silence was simply going to persist. I think we need to feel a little bit of that weight when we come to a story like the one we have today from the Gospel of Luke. We need to feel something of how deep that silence was in order to understand the way the disciples respond. Because when Jesus shows up among them with words of peace, their first reaction is not, hey, look, Jesus was telling the truth. He is back from the dead. No. Their first reaction is, what in the world is going on here? Their first reaction is, this can't really be happening. It's a little bit comforting to see that, isn't it? To see that Jesus' own disciples, the ones who kind of had the best chance to expect this, the best chance to really make sense of it, still had a hard time with the resurrection. Even they wanted some assurance that they were not just dreaming all of this up. And I've been struck this week by how Jesus responds to those disciples who were startled and terrified at their first sight of him after Easter. He doesn't go to reprimanding them for their forgetfulness, or to making rational arguments or offering deep theological teachings about what this means. First, he goes to the sense of touch. Touch me and see, he says. For a ghost does not have flesh and bone as you see that I have. The writer Parker Palmer tells a story from his personal experience with clinical depression. He faced a serious bout of depression in his 40s that left him emotionally paralyzed, unable to work or write or engage meaningfully with others. And while he was in the depths of that time, many well-meaning friends and family came to see him, to try to be of help. They had all sorts of things to say, Some would tell him that it was a really beautiful day outside, and he should just get outside and feel the sunshine and smell the flowers, and he would feel lots better. But that just made it worse, Palmer said, because he didn't have the energy to get up and go outside, and he knew that even if he did, he wouldn't manage to really feel anything. He knew it would only add a burden of grief on top of everything else he was already feeling. Others told him what a great person he was, how successful he was, how he had so much to offer to others, how he could still do so much good. And while the people saying those sorts of things meant well, the words didn't help. They just reminded him of everything that he really could not physically do at that moment. Through those dark weeks and months, many came to see him, but Palmer says there was really only one person who was of very much help. An old friend asked one day if he could rub Parker Palmer's feet, and Palmer agreed. And the friend came to visit every day after that. He said few words, but just knelt down and rubbed the soles of his feet. And Palmer said that turned out to be about the only place he could feel anything at all during those weeks. In the state that he was in, words really couldn't reach him, but that compassionate sense of touch could. I think that could be one part of what's going on with this scene between Jesus and these fearful, confused, grieving disciples. Touch can sometimes reach us in a way that words alone can't. And so Jesus stands in front of them, not with lengthy explanations at first, but simply with his outstretched hands. Touch me and see, for a ghost does not have flesh and bone, as you see that I have. Maybe that's part of it. But there's more here. Because it seems clear that Jesus wants to show his disciples that he's really there in the flesh. He wants his friends to see that even in the resurrection, he has a body. I'm not sure that we're always comfortable with this part. Lots of us struggle to understand what the resurrection means, after all, to imagine what it means for Jesus to conquer death and rise again. We might land sometimes on some kind of vague, airy answers to that question, maybe about Jesus' life and ministry and memory continuing in the life and ministry and memory of his friends. We might be comfortable with leaving it mostly to mystery. But Luke is not vague here, whatever else you say about this account. After the cross and the resurrection, Jesus has a body, says Luke. Do you have anything to eat? He asks. It's not a question for a disembodied spirit to ask. It's a question for someone with taste buds and a digestive tract. I know that the bodily resurrection can be difficult to talk about, at least for me. And it feels like we pretty quickly bump up against the limits of what we can reasonably imagine we understand. I'm not here to tell you I know the one right way to think about this. But for a moment, just sit with what an odd and incredible claim this is. I mean, a religion with an empty tomb at its center could be one that really goes the direction of being totally otherworldly. It could talk about the spirit alone, as though the body really didn't matter. It could talk about how the body is just a cage for the soul. It could talk about how the goal of life is to transcend these corruptible forms that we have that we're going to leave behind anyway. You could imagine how Christianity could turn that direction. And of course, Christians actually have talked like that a whole lot over the centuries. But it's a very long way from where the message began. Because the way the earliest Christians saw it, Easter is not about shedding the body, but about redeeming it. The earliest Christians believed that the event of Easter redeemed Jesus' body from the violence that had been done to it. And in Easter, they saw the promise that their own bodies, too, would be redeemed, that their flesh and bones were part of the goodness of how they had been created by God and wouldn't simply be left behind. You can imagine something of how important this idea was for the early church when you remember how horribly many of the earliest Christians were treated in those first centuries. when martyrs had their bodies ripped apart and sometimes scattered for their faith, they took this promise very seriously. They clung to the promise that God's healing and restoration includes everything that we are: spirits, minds, and yes, bodies. They saw Jesus' body as connected to their own. So when Jesus meets his disciples on this side of Easter and shows them his hands and his feet, when he invites them to touch the places where the nails had been, when he eats with them like he had so many times before in life, it seems that maybe something like this is going on. "See," he says to them, "it's me, all of me, including flesh and bone, caught up in God's new life." If we take this seriously, and I think that we should, then it means we might start seeing the bodies around us differently. We might start seeing them, all of them, as the holy vessels that they are, part of God's good creation, even included in God's promise of resurrection. It means that God's promise holds the body that is struggling with cancer, and the body that is abused, and the body that is devalued or despised because it doesn't look like the current ideal, and the body that is tired and showing its age, and the body that is marching to demand justice, and the body that is wiping a child's nose, and the body that is under siege in war, and the body that is there to provide help. God's promise is there to honor them all and to encompass them all. When Jesus shows up on the other side of the grave with hands to touch and a stomach to digest, I think he's pointing to just how far God's promise of resurrection means to go. It means to hold everything: our spirits, our bodies, the earth beneath our feet. God means to leave nothing out of the new life that's to come. So that's a lot to take in, I know. Good thing you have a chance to practice. Good thing you have the body of Christ gathered around you this morning. Good thing you will be handed Christ's body here around the communion table. Good thing that you will walk out this morning into a world that is charged with the promise of resurrection. No one saw it coming, but it did come. The promise in the flesh that all will be made new in the love of God. It's a promise that can still leave our hearts burning and that can still open our minds and our spirits to that great, unexpected joy. Amen.